Meditations on First Philosophy, René Descartes, 1641. Meditation 4. Of the True and the False. I have been well accustomed these past days to detach my mind from my senses, and I have accurately observed that there are very few things that one knows with certainty respecting corporeal objects, that there are many more which are known to us respecting the human mind, and yet more still regarding God himself. So that I shall now, without any difficulty, abstract my thoughts from the consideration of imaginable objects, and carry them to those which, being withdrawn from all contact with matter, are purely intelligible. And certainly the idea which I possess of the human mind, inasmuch as it is a thinking thing, and not extended in length, width, and depth, nor participating in anything pertaining to body, is incomparably more distinct than is the idea of any corporeal thing. And when I consider that I doubt, that is to say, that I am an incomplete and dependent being, the idea of a being that is complete and independent, that is, of God, presents itself to my mind with so much distinctness and clearness, and from the fact alone that this idea is found in me, or that I who possess this idea exist, I conclude so certainly that God exists, and that my existence depends entirely on him in every moment of my life, that I do not think that the human mind is capable of knowing anything with more evidence and certitude. And it seems to me that I now have before me a road which will lead us from the contemplation of the true God, in whom all the treasures of science and wisdom are contained, to the knowledge of the other objects of the universe. For, first of all, I recognize it to be impossible that he should ever deceive me, for in all fraud and deception some imperfection is to be found, and although it may appear that the power of deception is a mark of subtlety or power, yet the desire to deceive without doubt testifies to malice or feebleness, and accordingly cannot be found in God. In the next place, I experienced in myself a certain capacity for judging which I have doubtless received from God, like all the other things I possess. And as he could not desire to deceive me, it is clear that he has not given me a faculty that will lead me to err if I use it aright. And no doubt respecting this matter could remain, if it were not that the consequence would seem to follow that I can thus never be deceived. For if I hold all that I possess from God, and if he has not placed in me the capacity for error, it seems as though I could never fall into error. And it is true that when I think only of God, and direct my mind wholly to him, I discover in myself no cause of error or falsity. Yet directly afterwards, when recurring to myself, experience shows me that I am nevertheless subject to an infinitude of errors, as to which, when we come to investigate them more closely, I notice that not only is there a real and positive idea of God or of a being of supreme perfection present to my mind, but also, so to speak, a certain negative idea of nothing, that is, of that which is infinitely removed from any kind of perfection, and that I am, in a sense, something intermediate between God and not. i.e., placed in such a manner between the Supreme Being and non-being, that there is, in truth, nothing in me that can lead to error in so far as a sovereign being has formed me, but that, as I in some degree participate, likewise in not or in non-being, i.e., in so far as I am not myself the Supreme Being, and as I find myself subject to an infinitude of imperfections, I ought not to be astonished if I should fall into error. Thus do I recognize that error, insofar as it is such, is not a real thing depending on God, but simply a defect, and therefore, in order to fall into it, that I have no need to possess a special faculty given me by God for this very purpose, but that I fall into error from the fact that the power given me by God for the purpose of distinguishing truth from error is not infinite. Nevertheless, this does not quite satisfy me, for error is not a pure negation, i.e., is not the dimpled defect or want of some perfection which ought not to be mine, but it is a lack of some knowledge which it seems that I ought to possess. And on considering the nature of God, it does not appear to me possible that he should have given me a faculty which is not perfect of this kind, that is, which is wanting in some perfection due to it. For if it is true that the more skillful the artisan, the more perfect is the work of his hands, what can have produced by this supreme creator of all things that is not, in all its parts, perfect? And certainly there is no doubt that God could have created me so that I could never have been subject to error. It is also certain that he ever wills what is best. It is then better that I should be subject to error than that I should not. In considering this more attentively, it occurs to me, in the first place, that I should not be astonished if my intelligence is not capable of comprehending why God acts as he does, and that there is thus no reason to doubt of his existence from the fact that I may perhaps find many other things besides this, as to which I am able to understand neither for what reason nor how God has produced them. For, in the first place, knowing that my nature is extremely feeble and limited, and that the nature of God is, on the contrary, immense, incomprehensible, and infinite, I have no further difficulty in recognizing that there is an infinitude of matter in his power, the causes of which transcend my knowledge, and this reason suffices to convince me that the species of cause termed final finds no useful employment in physical things, for it does not appear to me that I can without temerity seek to investigate the inscrutable ends of God. It further occurs to me that we should not consider one single creature separately when we inquire as to whether the works of God are perfect, but should regard all his creations together. For the same thing which might possibly seem very imperfect with some semblance of reason if regarded by itself, is found to be very perfect if regarded as part of the whole universe. And although, since I resolved to doubt all things, I as yet have only known certainly my own existence and that of God, nevertheless, since I have recognized the infinite power of God, I cannot deny that he may have produced many other things, or, at least that he has the power of producing them, so that I may obtain a place as a part of a great universe. Whereupon, regarding myself more closely, and considering what are my errors, for they alone testify to there being any imperfection in me, I answer that they depend on a combination of two causes, to wit, on the faculty of knowledge that rests in me, and on the power of choice or of free will, that is to say, of the understanding and at the same time of the will. For by the understanding alone, I apprehend the ideas of things as to which I can form a judgment. But no error is, properly speaking, found in it, provided the word error is taken in its proper signification. And though there is possibly an infinitude of things in the world of which I have no idea in my understanding, we cannot for all that say that it is deprived of these ideas, but simply it does not possess these, because in truth there is no reason to prove that God should have given me a greater faculty of knowledge than he has given me. And however skillful a workman I represent him to be, I should not, for all that, consider that he was bound to have placed in each of his works all the perfections which he may have been able to place in some. I likewise cannot complain that God has not given me a free choice or a will, which is sufficient, ample, and perfect, since, as a matter of fact, I am conscious of a will so extended as to be subject to no limits. And what seems to me very remarkable in this regard is that all the qualities which I possess, there is no one so perfect and comprehensive that I do not very clearly recognize that it might yet be greater and more perfect. For to take an example, if I consider the faculty of comprehension which I possess, I find that it is of very small extent and extremely limited, and at the same time I find the idea of another faculty much more ample and even infinite, and seeing that I can form the idea of it, I recognize from this very fact that it pertains to the nature of God. If in the same way I examine the memory, the imagination, or some other faculty, I do not find any which is not small and circumscribed, while in God it is immense or infinite. It is free will alone, or liberty of choice, which I find to be so great in me that I can conceive no other idea to be more great. It is indeed the case that it is for the most part this will that causes me to know that in some manner I bear the image and similitude of God. For although the power of will is incomparably greater in God than in me, both by reason of the knowledge and the power which, conjoined with it, render it stronger and more efficacious, and by reason of its object, inasmuch as in God it extends to a great many things, it nevertheless does not seem to me greater if I consider it formally and precisely in itself. For the faculty of will consists alone in our having the power of choosing to do a thing, or choosing not to do it. That is, to affirm or deny, to pursue or to shun it. Or rather, it consists alone in the fact that in order to affirm or deny, pursue or shun those things placed before us by the understanding, we act so that we are unconscious that any outside force constrains us in doing so. For in order that I should be free, it is not necessary that I should be indifferent as to the choice of one or the other of two contraries, but contrariwise, the more I lean to the one, whether I recognize clearly that the reasons of the good and true are to be found in it, or whether God so disposes my inward thought, the more freely do I choose and embrace it. And undoubtedly, both divine grace and natural knowledge, far from diminishing my liberty, rather increase it and strengthen it. Hence this indifference which I feel when I am not swayed to one side rather than to the other by lack of reason, is the lowest grade of liberty, and rather evinces a lack or negation in knowledge than a perfection of will. For if I always recognized clearly what was true and good, I should never have trouble in deliberating as to what judgment or choice I should make, and then I should be entirely free without ever being indifferent. From all this, I recognize that the power of will, which I have received from God, is not of itself the source of my errors, for it is very ample and very perfect of its kind, any more than is the power of understanding. For since I understand nothing but by the power which God has given me for understanding, there is no doubt that all that I understand as I ought, and it is not possible that I err in this. Whence, then, come my errors? They come from the sole fact that, since the will is much wider in its range and compass than the understanding, I do not restrain it within the same bounds, but extend it also to things which I do not understand. And, as the will is of itself indifferent to these, it easily falls into error and sin, and chooses the evil for the good, or the false for the true. For example, when I lately examined whether anything existed in the world, and found that from the very fact that I considered this question it followed very clearly that I myself existed, I could not prevent myself from believing that a thing I so clearly conceived was true. Not that I found myself compelled to do so by some external cause, but simply because from great clearness in my mind there followed a great inclination of my will. And I believed this with so much the greater freedom or spontaneity, as I possessed the less indifference toward it. Now, on the contrary, I not only know that I exist, inasmuch as I am a thinking thing, but a certain representation of corporeal nature is also presented to my mind. And it comes to pass that I doubt whether this thinking nature which is in me, or rather by which I am what I am, differs from this corporeal nature, or whether both are not simply the same thing. And here I suppose that I do not yet know any reason to persuade me to adopt the one belief rather than the other. From this it follows that I am entirely indifferent as to which of the two I affirm or deny, or even whether I abstain from forming any judgment in the matter. And this indifference does not only extend to matters as to which the understanding has no knowledge, but also in general to all those which are not apprehended with perfect clearness at the moment when the will is deliberating upon them. For however probable are the conjectures which render me disposed to form a judgment respecting anything, the simple knowledge that I have that those are conjectures alone, and not certain and indubitable reasons, suffices to occasion me to judge the contrary. Of this I have had great experience of late, when I set aside as false all that I had formerly held to be absolutely true, for the sole reason that I remarked that it might in some measure be doubted. But if I abstain from giving my judgment on any thing when I do not perceive it with sufficient clearness and distinctness, it is plain that I act rightly and am not deceived. But if I determine to deny or affirm, I no longer make use as I should of my free will, and if I affirm what is not true, it is evident that I deceive myself. Even though I judge according to truth, this comes about only by chance, and I do not escape the blame of misusing my freedom. For the light of nature teaches us that the knowledge of the understanding should always precede the determination of the will. And it is in the misuse of the free will that the privation which constitutes the characteristic nature of error is met with. Privation, I say, is found in the act, in so far as it proceeds from me. But it is not found in the faculty which I have received from God, nor even in the act in so far as it depends on him. For I have certainly no cause to complain that God has not given me an intelligence which is more powerful, or a natural light which is stronger than that which I have received from him, since it is proper to the finite understanding not to comprehend a multitude of things, and it is proper to a created understanding to be finite. On the contrary, I have every reason to render thanks to God, who owes me nothing, and who has given me all the perfections I possess, and I should be far from charging him with injustice, and with having deprived me of, or wrongfully withheld from me, these perfections which he has not bestowed upon me. I have further no reason to complain that he has given me a will more ample than my understanding. For since the will consists only of one single element, and is, so to speak, indivisible, it appears that its nature is such that nothing can be abstracted from it without destroying it. And certainly the more comprehensive it is found to be, the more reason I have to render gratitude to the giver. And finally, I must also not complain that God concurs with me in forming the acts of the will, that is, the judgment in which I go astray, because these acts are entirely true and good, inasmuch as they depend on God. And in a certain sense, more perfection accrues to my nature from the fact that I can form them than if I could not do so. As to the privation, in which alone the formal reason of error or sin consists, it has no need of any concurrence from God, since it is not a thing or an existence, and since it is not related to God as to a cause, but should be termed merely a negation, according to the significance given to these words in the schools. For in fact, it is not an imperfection in God that he has given me the liberty to give or withhold my assent from certain things, as to which he has not placed a clear and distinct knowledge in my understanding. But it is without a doubt an imperfection in me not to make a good use of my freedom, and to give my judgment readily on matters which I only understand obscurely. I nevertheless perceive that God could easily have created me so that I never should err, although I still remain free and endowed with a limited knowledge, viz., by giving to my understanding a clear and distinct intelligence of all things as to which I should ever have to deliberate, or simply by his engraving deeply in my memory the resolution never to form a judgment on anything without having a clear and distinct understanding of it, so that I could never forget it. And it is easy for me to understand that, in so far as I consider myself alone, and as if there were only myself in the world, I should have been much more perfect than I am, if God had created me so that I could never err. Nevertheless, I cannot deny that, in some sense, it is a greater perfection in the whole universe that certain parts should not be exempt from error, as others are, than that all parts should be exactly similar. And I have no right to complain if God, having placed me in the world, has not called upon me to play a part that excels all others in distinction and perfection. And further, I have reason to be glad on the ground that if he has not given me the power of never going astray by the first means pointed out above, which depends on a clear and evident knowledge of all the things regarding which I can deliberate, he has at least left within my power the other means, which is firmly to adhere to the resolution never to give judgment on matters whose truth is not clearly known to me. For although I notice a certain weakness in my nature, in that I cannot continually concentrate my mind on one single thought, I can yet, by attentive and frequently repeated meditation, impress it so forcibly on my memory that I shall never fail to recollect it whenever I have need of it, and thus acquire the habit of never going astray. And inasmuch as it is in this that the greatest and principal perfection of man consists, it seems to me that I have not gained little by this day's meditation, since I have discovered the source of falsity and error. And certainly there can be no other source than that which I have explained. For as often as I so restrain my will within the limits of my knowledge that it forms no judgment except on matters which are clearly and distinctly represented to it by the understanding, I can never be deceived. For every clear and distinct conception is without doubt something, and hence cannot derive its origin from what is not, but must of necessity have God as its author. God, I say, who being supremely perfect, cannot be the cause of any error. And consequently we must conclude that such a conception or such a judgment is true. Nor have I only learned today what I should avoid in order that I may not err, but also how I should act in order to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. For without doubt I shall arrive at this end if I devote my attention sufficiently to those things which I perfectly understand, and if I separate from these that which I only understand confusedly and with obscurity. To these I shall henceforth diligently give heed.